I know when something is wrong. I've always had that instinct, the kind you develop after 40 years of reading structural blueprints and understanding that the smallest crack in the foundation is never just cosmetic. So when I walked into that notary's office on a Tuesday morning in November and saw my son-in-law sitting in the chair beside the window, wearing that quiet, patient smile of his, every nerve in my body fired at once. He wasn't supposed to be there. Nobody had told me he'd be there. And the way he looked up at me, unhurried, like he'd been expecting me, like he'd been there 100 times before, and this was simply one more visit, told me that whatever was about to happen in that room had been arranged long before I arrived. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this really started. Let me go back to the morning they found my brother. His name was Walter. Walter James Aldridge. He was my older brother by 6 years, which made him 69 when he died. And for as long as I can remember, he was the most careful man I ever knew. Careful in the way of men who grew up watching everything their parents worked for disappear. Our father lost his machine shop in Kelowna in the late 70s, and Walter carried that lesson like a stone in his chest, his whole life. He didn't take risks. He checked locks twice. He drove 5 kilometers under the speed limit on the Trans-Canada and somehow made that seem reasonable. He was not a man who died in accidents. They told me he slipped on the back steps of his house in Victoria. January, black ice, nobody home. Fell and struck the back of his head on the concrete landing. By the time his neighbor noticed the lights on all morning and knocked at the door, he'd been gone for hours. The coroner ruled it accidental. A 69-year-old man, some arterial stiffness, a bad fall in winter. These things happen. I didn't believe it then. I believe it even less now. Walter had lived in the same house on Foul Bay Road for 22 years. He knew every inch of that property. He'd resurfaced those back steps himself 3 winters earlier and put down grip tape along every edge. I helped him do it. I remember standing in his driveway on a cold Saturday afternoon, drinking coffee from a thermos, while he fussed over the installation like it was load-bearing infrastructure. That was Walter. That was exactly who he was. The funeral was held on a gray Friday in late January, the kind of Victoria morning where the sky sits so low you feel it pressing on your shoulders. My daughter Claire flew in from Calgary. She came alone. My son-in-law, Connor, had a work commitment he couldn't reschedule, she explained. And she said it with her eyes pointed somewhere past my shoulder, which is something Claire had started doing about 2 years earlier whenever she spoke about him. I'd noticed it. I'd filed it away and told myself it was none of my business. Claire was 31. She'd met Connor through her firm, where he worked as a financial consultant, and they'd been married for 4 years. He was 38, well-dressed in the way of men who understand that appearance is a form of control, and he had this quality of stillness about him that I'd initially mistaken for depth. He was attentive to Claire in public, thoughtful. He remembered details, birthdays, preferences, the names of her friends from university. I told myself my wariness was just a father's protectiveness. I told myself he was a good husband. At the reception after the service, Claire and I sat together in Walter's kitchen, while her 2 cousins and Walter's few remaining friends moved quietly through the rooms. She held her teacup with both hands the way she used to do as a child when she was upset and trying not to show it. "Dad," she said finally, "Connor thinks I should take a leave of absence from the firm. He thinks the grief is affecting my work." I looked at her. "Is it?" "I don't know." She paused. "He's been managing our finances for the past year. He says it's better while I'm not focused." I chose my words the way you choose your footing on an unstable surface. "Since when does Connor manage your finances?" "Since I signed things over to him." He explained it made sense. Tax purposes. He knows these structures. I didn't say what I was thinking. This was my daughter's marriage, and she was grieving, and this was not the moment. So I held it. I thanked the neighbors who'd come. I helped wrap the leftover food, and I drove back to my hotel telling myself that what I was feeling was just the suspicious mind of an old engineer who'd spent his career looking for faults. Walter's notary called me 10 days later. His name was Gerald Park, and he'd handled Walter's affairs for 15 years. He said he needed me to come in for the reading of the will. He said there were a few things he'd been asked to share with me personally. He also said my son-in-law had already called to arrange attendance on Claire's behalf. I should have asked more questions then. I drove to Victoria from my home in Nanaimo on a Thursday morning. I parked on Cook Street and walked the last 2 blocks in the cold. And I was thinking about Walter the whole way, about his careful hands and his grip tape and the impossible image of him lying alone on those back steps in the dark. I opened the door to Gerald Park's office, and there he was, Connor, sitting in the chair beside the window in a charcoal suit, his hands folded in his lap, that calm smile already in place, a leather portfolio open on the table in front of him. "Richard," he said. He always used my full name. Never Frank, never Dad, always Richard, which was not even my name. "My name is Frank." I looked at Gerald Park, who was standing behind his desk with an expression that told me he was not entirely comfortable with the situation either. "Where is my daughter?" I asked. Connor answered before Gerald could speak. "Claire isn't feeling well this week. She asked me to represent her. I have documentation authorizing me to act on her behalf in all financial and legal matters." He slid a paper across the table. "The power of attorney was executed 8 months ago." 8 months ago. I sat down slowly. Gerald Park cleared his throat. He outlined Walter's will in the careful, measured tone of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and has learned to modulate the delivery. Walter had left his house on Foul Bay Road and the bulk of his investments to Claire, a smaller portion to a nature conservancy he'd supported for years. The business account from his long-closed consulting practice to me. Then Connor leaned forward and opened his portfolio. "As Claire's legal representative, I'm also here to discuss the property. She's agreed we should list the house as quickly as possible. Victoria real estate moves fast. I've already spoken with an agent." I said. Claire agreed to that. She did. She's not in a state to manage these decisions right now. The grief has been harder on her than she lets on. Her therapist has recommended she step back from major decisions for the time being. Something cold and exact settled in my chest. I'd like to speak with her therapist. That's not something I can facilitate. Patient privacy. She's my daughter. She's my wife. The smile didn't waver, and she's asked for space from family stress while she heals. I'm sure you understand. I understood nothing except that I needed to get out of that room before I said or did something I couldn't take back. Gerald Park spoke up then, quietly. "Mr. Aldridge, before you go, there's something I need to share with you privately." He looked at Connor. Walter left specific instructions that this portion of the meeting be conducted with Frank alone. Connor's composure held, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. A tightening. I'm here as Claire's legal representative. Whatever Walter intended to share with Frank is now within scope of... It isn't. Gerald's voice was pleasant, but final. Walter's instructions were explicit. This is a personal matter, not an estate matter. You'll need to step out. The moment stretched. Connor looked at me, looked at Gerald, and then stood in the unhurried way of a man who wants you to know that leaving a room is a choice he is making, not a concession he is granting. He walked out and closed the door with exquisite care. Gerald waited. He went to a credenza behind his desk and returned with a tin, an old Macintosh toffee tin, the kind you see at Christmas. He set it on the table in front of me. "Walter brought this to me 11 months ago," he said. "He didn't make an appointment. He just came in one morning and asked if he could leave this in my safekeeping. He said I was to give it only to you, only in person, and only if he died before he could give it to you himself." Gerald sat down. "He also said that if he died in an accident or of sudden illness, I should tell you that in his opinion, it was neither." My hands felt strange, distant. "He seemed worried," Gerald continued. "I asked him if he wanted to talk about it. He said he didn't know enough yet to talk about it properly, and that he didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily. He said if nothing happened, he'd come back and collect the tin, and you'd never need to know." He paused. He never came back. I opened the tin. Inside was a USB drive, a folded sheet of notepaper, and a small key on a plain ring with a tag that read, "Tackle Box Bottom Shelf, Garage." Walter's handwriting on the notepaper was unhurried and precise. He'd been a technical writer before he retired, and even in what must have been a frightened hour, his sentences were clean. "Frank," he wrote, "if you're reading this, something happened to me, and I wasn't able to reach you in time. I'm sorry for that. I want you to know I didn't go without trying to protect Claire. I started watching Connor 14 months ago. It began at Claire's birthday dinner when I overheard him on his phone in the side yard. He didn't know I was on the back porch. He was speaking to someone about a timeline, about assets being accessible, about an old man who'd outlived his usefulness. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough to make me start paying attention. I hired an investigator. Her name is Patricia Mead. Her report is on the drive. What she found. Connor's legal name is Connor Paul Rafferty, but he has lived under 3 different names. Before Calgary, he was in Winnipeg as Colin Reed, married to a woman named Diane, who died of an accidental medication overdose. Before Winnipeg, he was in Halifax as Carl Renfrew, common law with a woman named Joan, whose elderly father had a fatal fall down a flight of stairs 8 months into their relationship. In both cases, significant assets moved to Connor before or shortly after the deaths. In both cases, no charges were ever laid. Patricia's full report is on the drive, along with documentation from the provincial registries. Claire doesn't know. I tried twice to raise concerns gently, without frightening her, and both times she told me I was projecting and that Connor was the most supportive partner she'd ever had. She believes this completely. She is not stupid. She has been worked on carefully for a long time. Connor is also doing something to her. Patricia documented that Claire was prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication by a walk-in clinic, the visit arranged by Connor. I found the prescription in her bathroom last September when I was visiting. The dosage seemed high for what it was prescribed for. She's less sharp than she used to be, slower to decisions, more reliant on him. This is not my Claire. There is also a woman named Sandra. I don't have her last name yet. Patricia photographed them together 3 times. She appears to be Connor's partner in the financial part of this. She has access to accounts I think Claire doesn't know exist. The tackle box in my garage has another envelope. Take it before anyone else goes into that house. Frank, I need you to do something for me. I need you to get to Claire before he finishes what he's started. He married her for the inheritance that was coming to her from me. Now that I'm gone, he has it. But I think that was never going to be enough for someone like him. Please be careful. He is not what he appears to be, and he is very good at appearing. I love you, brother. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. I sat in Gerald Park's office for a long moment and did not trust myself to stand. Then I asked Gerald if I could use his washroom. Went inside, sat on the closed lid of the toilet, and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. When I came back out, I told Gerald I needed him to do something. I needed a full review of Walter's death. I needed a second medical opinion on the coroner's findings. I needed Walter's body preserved until that was complete. Gerald looked at me for a moment, and then nodded, quietly, as if he had been waiting for someone to say exactly this. Connor was in the waiting room. He looked up without any particular expression as I came through. "Everything resolved?" he asked. "Just some personal items," I said. "Walter's old fishing gear. You know how he was." Connor nodded with something that might, to anyone else, have looked like sympathetic understanding. I drove to Walter's house that afternoon. I still had a key. I went through the garage to the bottom shelf and found the old tackle box under a folded tarpaulin. And inside the tin lure tray, at the bottom, I found a sealed envelope and a second USB drive and 3 months of printed bank statements with certain lines circled in red ink. That night in my hotel room, I read everything Patricia Mead had compiled, and I listened to the audio files on the second drive, which Walter had recorded himself on his phone during 3 separate visits to Claire and Connor's house in Calgary. Connor's voice talking to someone on the phone in another room. Measured, precise, talking about moving assets before the old man's estate was settled. Talking about the medication being adjusted. Talking about how much easier it would be once Claire's father was also out of the picture, because a grieving daughter with no surviving immediate family and an established pattern of mental health challenges was considerably easier to manage than one with a protective parent asking inconvenient questions. I am next, I thought. Walter was first. Claire is ongoing. I am next. I called Patricia Mead the following morning. She was professional and direct, and she told me the same thing I already knew. Everything she had was circumstantial. Photographs of meetings, financial trails that were suggestive but not conclusive, recorded conversations that were ambiguous enough that a competent lawyer could dismantle them. She said she'd been building the case for 11 months on Walter's behalf, and she was close. But close was not enough to go to the RCMP with. I went anyway. The officer I spoke with at the Victoria detachment was a corporal named Diane Sutherland. She was about 50, efficient, and she listened to everything I had without interrupting. When I finished, she said the same thing Patricia had said. She said circumstantial was not nothing, but it wasn't enough. She said the power of attorney was a significant legal barrier. She said that if Claire had signed it willingly, even under influence, it would take a court order to challenge it, and that would take time. And she said, if we're going to move on this, we need something concrete. We need him doing something, not just talking about it. How? I asked. Do we get him to do something? She looked at me carefully. She said that sometimes the way to catch a careful person was to give them a reason to stop being careful. We talked for 2 hours. By the time I left, we had the outline of a plan, and I had her personal number. She also told me something that changed everything. She knew Sandra's last name, Sandra Voss. She was a licensed insurance broker in Calgary, and Corporal Sutherland had a contact in the Calgary Financial Crimes Unit who'd had Sandra Voss on a watch list for 3 years in connection with a different file. 2 careful people, connected, both very good at appearing to be something else. The plan was straightforward. Corporal Sutherland would work through proper channels to request a formal review of Walter's death based on the evidence I'd provided. That process would be visible, a matter of public record, and Connor would almost certainly become aware of it through his contacts. At the same time, I would make it known, through Gerald Park's office, that my own health was declining, prostate issues that had become something more serious. I would let this information travel through the channels it would naturally travel through. And then I would wait. I want to say I felt brave. I didn't. I drove back to Nanaimo that evening and sat in my house, which is a house I built most of myself on 10 acres outside of town, and I thought about Walter on those steps in January, and I felt nothing except a cold, methodical certainty that I was going to finish what my brother started. I also tried to reach Claire. I called her cell phone twice. She didn't answer. I sent a text saying I was thinking of her and asking if she wanted to have dinner. She replied 8 hours later, "Dad, I need some space to process everything. Please don't take it personally. Connor thinks a bit of distance from family stress will help me heal. I'm okay." It didn't read like Claire. The rhythm was wrong. She'd never said process everything in her life. 3 weeks later, Connor called me. He called on a Sunday evening, which he had never done before. His voice was warm, which he had never managed before either, and he said he'd heard I wasn't doing well and that Claire was concerned, and that he thought perhaps some family reconnection was overdue. He said Claire had been asking about me. He said they'd love to have me in Calgary for a weekend. He said Claire was making my favorite. "Butter chicken?" he said. "She told me you love it." Claire has never once made butter chicken. I have never, in her entire life, expressed a preference for butter chicken. That dish belongs to no version of me that my daughter would have described to her husband. I said that sounded lovely, and I booked a flight for the following Friday. Corporal Sutherland and I spent 3 evenings on the phone that week. She had a contact in the Calgary RCMP, a staff sergeant named Kevin Okafor who had been briefed on the full file. There would be surveillance. There would be a wire. There would be officers positioned. She was also pursuing a warrant for Sandra Voss's financial records based on the information from the Calgary unit. She told me one more thing before I got on the plane. She said the formal review of Walter's death had been escalated. The pathologist had requested a sample from the tissue preserved during the original autopsy. Walter had not been cremated. He was still at the mortuary, and the retained samples were still viable. She said it was preliminary, but there was something in the tox screen that didn't belong, a substance found in combination with the head trauma that might have incapacitated him before the fall rather than as a result of it. She said might. She said they needed more time. I don't think I slept on the plane. Claire answered the door when I arrived at their house in a quiet part of southwest Calgary on Friday evening. She looked thin. She had always been lean, but this was different. The kind of thinness that comes from the inside, from some ongoing drain that doesn't leave a visible wound. Her eyes were the thing that frightened me most. They were present but padded, the way eyes look when someone has been managing their reality chemically for a long time. She hugged me, and I held her carefully. The way you hold something you are afraid of breaking. Connor came to the door behind her and shook my hand with both of his, the grip warm and deliberate. And he said it was really good to have me here. And I looked at his face and told myself, 6 years. He has been inside my daughter's life for 6 years. We had dinner. I ate everything on my plate and kept my voice even and watched Connor watch me. And I thought about what Patricia Mead had written in her report about Diane in Winnipeg, about how she had been found in her apartment, about how everyone who knew her said she had seemed confused in the months before she died, about how her mother had said she was not herself. After dinner, Connor suggested Claire go to bed early because she'd been tired all week, and Claire agreed without any particular resistance, and I watched my daughter walk upstairs in her own home at 9 o'clock on a Friday evening because her husband had suggested it, and I held that image inside me and said nothing. Connor poured 2 glasses of whiskey and brought them to the living room, and we sat across from each other by the fireplace. He asked about my health. He was solicitous, careful. He said he'd heard the prognosis was concerning, and he wanted me to know that Claire would be well looked after, whatever happened, and that he considered me family. I sipped the whiskey and set it down and didn't pick it up again. I talked about my health in vague, discouraged terms. I watched him. He was very good. There was almost nothing to read in his face except ordinary human kindness. I went to bed at 10:30. I lay on the guest bed in the dark and listened to the house. At 2 in the morning I heard a door open and close softly downstairs. Then voices, low, a man and a woman who was not Claire. I moved to the top of the stairs and listened. Sandra Voss. I knew her voice from a recording on the second drive. She was there in the house, in the kitchen, and she and Connor were talking about timelines, about the review of Walter's death and how it needed to be contained before the toxicology went further. About me, about how the health situation was moving faster than expected and how that actually simplified certain things. About Claire, whom they referred to by name with the casual familiarity of people who have been discussing her management for years. Sandra said, "The dosage needs to come up slightly. She's been more alert this week than I'd like." Connor said, "I know. I'll handle it this weekend." Sandra said, "And the father," Connor said, "also this weekend. The cardiac history makes it clean, and with the review already open on the brother, a second family death from natural causes in the same year actually muddies things more than it clarifies. People stop looking for patterns when they seem impossible." I stood at the top of the stairs in the dark of my daughter's house and understood completely what I had walked into. I went back to the guest room. I texted Corporal Sutherland. She replied within 4 minutes. "Already monitoring. Stay in the room. Do not consume anything you haven't verified. Okafor's team is in position." I sat on the edge of the bed until 6 in the morning. I did not sleep. Claire made breakfast. Eggs, toast, orange juice already poured when I came downstairs. She was brighter in the morning, the way she'd always been before all of this. And for a moment she was so recognizably herself that something tightened in my throat. She talked about a project she'd been following in the news, a bridge rehabilitation outside Red Deer, and she asked me technical questions about the approach span design with the precise curiosity she'd had since she was 12 years old and used to sit in my truck on job sites asking me why. Connor was at the counter with his coffee, reading something on his phone. He didn't look at me. I didn't drink the orange juice. After breakfast, Connor suggested we go for a walk. There was a park 2 blocks over. It was cold but clear, a bright February Calgary morning with 6 inches of packed snow on the path, and Connor walked beside me at a comfortable pace and asked me how I was managing the diagnosis emotionally And I said it was an adjustment, and he said that was understandable. Then he said, I want to talk to you about Claire's inheritance, about what happens when the estate is settled. He said it with the tone of a man raising a practical subject between reasonable adults. He said he'd had a conversation with a financial planner about how to structure things most efficiently, and he wanted to make sure I had the chance to put the right instruments in place while I still had capacity to do it. While I still had capacity. I said I'd want to think about it. He nodded. He said, of course. He said there was no rush. He just wanted me to have all the information. We walked back to the house. I went upstairs to get my jacket, and I stood in the hallway and heard Claire's voice from her room, very quiet, and I hesitated, and then I knocked. She opened the door, and she was holding her phone, and she looked at me with her father's eyes, my eyes, and for 1 second her face was completely unguarded, and I saw something in it that was not confusion and was not sedation. It was recognition. She looked over my shoulder to confirm Connor wasn't there, and then she stepped back from the door and let me in. And she closed it behind me, and she took my hand and she said, quietly and with absolute steadiness, Dad, I know. I looked at my daughter. I know what he is, she said. I've known for 7 months. Since I found a bank statement in his car for an account that doesn't have my name on it and has been receiving transfers from our joint account for 2 years. Her voice was controlled and clear. I stopped taking the pills 4 months ago. I hid them. I've been pretending. I sat down on the edge of her bed. I couldn't call you directly. He monitors my phone, but I found a way. She unlocked her phone and showed me an app, something disguised as a language learning program. Uncle Walter helped me set this up. Before he died, we'd been in contact. He told me what he'd found, and I told him what I'd found, and we were building it together. Her eyes went wet for the first time. He was going to come to Calgary in February. He never made it, I said. Walter knew you knew? He knew I was trying to get evidence. He was so careful about it, Dad. He kept saying we needed enough that Connor couldn't lawyer his way out. She exhaled slowly. I have 7 months of recordings, his phone conversations, his meetings with Sandra in this house, everything. I used the smoke detector in the kitchen. There's a recording device inside it. Connor had it swept for listening devices 6 months ago, and the detector was clean because it looks completely standard. She paused. I ordered it from a security supply company in Vancouver and had it shipped to my office. My daughter who used to sit in my truck and ask me about bridge spans. The RCMP, I said. Do you know? I reached Corporal Sutherland's office 3 weeks ago, under my maiden name, from my office phone. She knows. We've been coordinating. I stared at her. How did you know about Sutherland? Because Gerald Park reached out to me, not through my regular email, through an old university account Connor doesn't know exists. He told me you'd been to see him. She almost smiled. Dad, we've all been trying to protect each other, and nobody was talking to each other. Downstairs, I heard Connor's footsteps, moving toward the kitchen. Claire looked at me. He's going to do something this weekend. I heard him last night. I know. Sandra was here. She nodded. The breakfast. The orange juice. I didn't drink it. I know. I poured it out when he wasn't watching and refilled the glass from the tap. I didn't know if you'd realize. We looked at each other. My daughter, 31 years old, who had been running a covert operation against the man she lived with for 7 months, without breaking, without giving herself away, without anyone to hold on to except an elderly notary passing messages through a dead email account. The RCMP are outside right now, I said. She exhaled, long and slow. I know. Sutherland texted me this morning. She said they had enough from last night. They were waiting for her to give the signal. She looked at her phone. She said, when I'm ready. I said, are you ready? Claire looked at me for a moment, and what I saw in her face was grief and fury and relief in equal measure, and also something that was just my daughter, just the person she had always been before any of this, bone steady, in the way that certain people are who were built right to begin with. She pressed send. We heard the knock at the front door 40 seconds later. 3 hard raps, official, the sound of authority that doesn't wait. We came downstairs together. Connor was in the entryway, his hand on the door handle and he opened it and found Staff Sergeant Okafor on the step with two uniformed officers and a woman I recognized from the file photographs as a financial crimes investigator from the Calgary unit. Behind them in the driveway there were two vehicles and several people who were not dressed as police but were carrying themselves as police do. Connor turned. He looked at Claire. He looked at me. And for the first time since I had known him, the careful architecture of his expression came apart. Not into rage or panic, but into something colder and more revealing. A flat, assessing look that showed you what was behind the warmth, what had been there the whole time, what Diane in Winnipeg and Joan's elderly father in Halifax had seen in the end if they'd seen anything at all. "Connor Paul Rafferty," Okafor said, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges including fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, and suspected involvement in the death of Walter James Aldridge. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay." Connor said nothing. He put his hands up in the precise, unhurried way of a man who had already, in this moment, moved on to calculating what came next. He was handcuffed and walked to the vehicle, and I watched him go without a word. Sandra Voss was arrested at her office on the same morning. She was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and financial crimes. She did not stay quiet as long as Connor did. She cooperated within 48 hours of arrest, and what she gave the investigators was comprehensive and exact, because Sandra Voss's instinct for self-preservation was considerably stronger than her loyalty to a man she had always understood to be a variable rather than a partner. Walter's toxicology came back 6 weeks later. There was a compound in the tissue samples, a sedative, at a level consistent with incapacitation rather than voluntary use. The pathologist revised the cause of death to suspicious circumstances pending full investigation. 2 months after that, the finding was updated to homicide. Connor was charged. The investigation into Diane's death in Winnipeg was reopened. So was the investigation into Joan's father's fall in Halifax. I don't know where those cases will end up. I know only that Corporal Sutherland called me on a Tuesday evening to tell me about the Winnipeg development, and that she said quietly, before she hung up, "Your brother's file was what opened all of it." It started there. It started with Walter, who brought a toffee tin to a notary's office and asked him to hold it, just in case. Who paid a private investigator for 14 months out of his own retirement savings without telling anyone, because he didn't yet have enough and he didn't want to cause alarm before he was certain. Who wrote a letter to his brother in the clear, careful handwriting of a technical writer and trusted that the right person would receive it at the right time. I keep that letter. It's in the tin, which sits on my desk in Nanaimo. I don't need to read it again. I have it memorized. But I keep it because some things need to remain physical, need to take up space in the actual world, as a record of the fact that someone was paying attention when it would have been easier not to. Claire is in Nanaimo now. She moved in with me in the spring while she finds a place of her own. She's back at work, consulting remotely while she recalibrates. She went off the medication with a proper doctor's supervision. And the recalibration took about 3 months and was not easy. And she did it with the same bone-steady quality she's had her whole life. Some evenings we sit on the back deck with coffee and look out over the property and don't say anything for a long time, and that silence is the most comfortable thing I have known in 2 years. She's seeing a therapist, a good one, someone she chose herself. She says the hardest part is not having trusted her own instincts sooner, and her therapist tells her that's the wrong way to frame it. That Connor was specifically skilled at making the instincts of people around him feel unreliable. Claire listens to this and nods and then says, I know, but I still wish I'd seen it sooner." I tell her, "You saw it in the end, and when you saw it, you didn't run. You stayed and built a case, methodically, for 7 months, without anyone to lean on." She says, "I had Uncle Walter." I say, "You had yourself." We're renovating Walter's house. Claire wants to keep it, which surprised me. She says it's the right thing to do, that selling it feels like losing him twice. We're going to rent it out eventually, but first we're going to fix it up, and I have been over every inch of it with the attention it deserves. The grip tape on the back steps is still in perfect condition. It was never going to cause anyone to fall. I think about Walter a great deal. I think about the particular kind of courage it takes to act carefully in a situation that frightens you, to move slowly and methodically when every instinct is screaming, to trust the process of building something solid when you don't know if you'll live to see it finished. He was like that about everything. The machine shop our father lost marked him early, and instead of making him afraid, it made him precise. He understood that the difference between things that hold and things that fail is almost always in the preparation, in the details that no one thinks to check until they need to. He checked them. He always checked them. Even at the end, when he must have known something was wrong, and must have been frightened, and must have been moving through his days in that house on Foul Bay Road, with the particular loneliness of a person who knows something they can't yet prove. Even then, he was methodical. A toffee tin, a notary, a key on a ring with a handwritten tag. I visit his memorial in early September each year, at the beach in Oak Bay where we used to dig for clams as kids. I bring coffee from a place he used to like on Fort Street, and I sit on the rocks, and I tell him what's happened. I told him about the charges. I told him about Claire coming home. I told him about the renovation, about the grip tape, about the room at the back of the house where I found his old surveying equipment still boxed up, still organized the way he kept everything. I told him I was sorry it took me so long. He'd been trying to tell me something was wrong, and I'd filled the silence with reassurances and called it respect for his boundaries, and told myself my unease was just grief in advance. I know better now. I will always know better now. If someone you love seems different, seems smaller than themselves, seem to be disappearing in increments that are too gradual to measure precisely but too consistent to dismiss, you pay attention. You do not tell yourself it's a marriage you don't understand, or a lifestyle that isn't yours to judge, or a grief response that needs space. You ask the question, you ask it directly, and you stay in the room for the answer, and you do not let the discomfort of asking be louder than the need to know. Walter asked the question. He stayed in the room. He built what he built as carefully as he built everything, and he handed it to me in a tin and trusted me to carry it the rest of the way. I won't forget that. I don't have it in me to forget it. My brother. The most careful man I ever knew, careful enough, in the end, to save everyone he loved from across whatever distance separates the living from the dead. I don't know exactly what that distance is. I only know that what reaches across it, what actually travels, is not grief and is not loss, though those travel too. What reaches across it, what persists, is attention, the deliberate, unglamorous, daily practice of paying attention to the people you love and refusing to look away when looking away would be easier. That is what Walter left me. Not the tin, not the drives, not the documents. That. And I intend, for whatever time I have left on these 10 acres in Nanaimo, with my daughter down the hall and the Pacific somewhere beyond the tree line, to be worthy of it.